to meet with other senior executives in the data and analytics space? In an environment that is created for connection and inspiration? Then why not join one of our in-person conferences? We have events all over the world, and you can find out the ones closest to you by visiting coriniumintelligence.com/events.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to July's edition of our Leading Female Execs Monthly panel discussion here on LinkedIn Live. Now, if this is your first time joining us, then each month we dive into a hot topic with a range of leaders from all over the world to give their thoughts and experiences on exactly that. Now, we do this live so that you have the opportunity to get involved, ask your questions. Thank you already to those joining us. It's great to have you in the comments section already. Now, without further ado, I'm going to bring on my panel because we're going to be diving into a rather deep topic today. It's quite a heavy one, data as a human right. Now, just before we went live, we were just having a discussion in which direction we think this conversation is going to go in. It's going to go in many directions. It's going to go all over the place. And I think that's exactly the beauty of this topic. But let's start with a round of introductions. Maritza, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Hello everyone, I am Maritza Curry. I am the Head of Data for BNP Paribas Personal Finance South Africa, and here we are better known as RCS Group.
Amazing, thank you Maritza. Kulani, if you wouldn't mind giving us an intro.
Hi, I'm Kulani. I head up the data management and the data governance team for Standard Bank in South Africa.
Amazing, thank you Kulani. And Wendy, an intro please.
Hi, I'm Wendy Gilbert. I'm the Deputy Director for Enterprise Business Intelligence for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I am based out of Seattle, Washington.
Amazing. Well, thank you, each of you, for joining me today. A really interesting topic to dive into, as I mentioned there at the top of the conversation. Now, if you would like to get your questions in, then please do pop them in the comments. I will gladly ask our brilliant panelists their thoughts and advice and experience on this topic as well. So, data as a human right. Big topic there. I think the best place for us to start is what springs to mind for you when you hear that as a title, when you hear that as a topic. What are the types of use case and experiences that brings up for you? Wendy, I wonder if you wouldn't mind going first.
Sure. It's all over the place, to be honest, when I think of the topic and where we might go when it comes to data as a human right. The first area that springs to my mind is data privacy and all of the focuses that we've had over the last few years, in particular with the global data protection regulations and the other countries that are implementing these new data privacy rules, that it's a constant balance between data access and data privacy. So we want access to our data. We also want our data to be private. I think there's that. There's also a lot around sharing of data. So data as a human right being at the foundation. Of course, we support a lot of grantees who have data that they want to be able to share with other grantees and be able to access that information. And something we want to support, but there's also a privacy component. Yeah, and those are the two main areas that spring to my mind.
Yeah, for sure. I did very much predict that the privacy piece would come into this conversation because it is that right to privacy, which we all have. And where does that then extend into your data? And I think constant struggle that many organizations are going through is really sifting and sorting that data, because we have obviously the very personal data, and then you've got what is regarded as not personal data, but then there's quite a gap in between that of gray area of, do you want everyone knowing this, yes or no, versus what is actually, you know, particularly protected under regulations such as GDPR, PIPEDA, etc. As well. So thank you, Wendy, for your intro thoughts there. Maritza, when it comes to data as a human right, what springs to mind for you?
So the first thing that came to mind for me was data privacy as well, because I think it's just so topical at the moment. And in fact, data privacy is considered a human right by the United Nations. So I think that is quite an obvious one. The other one that Wendy started touching on is data that's being used for good. So as a citizen, whether you're a vulnerable citizen or not, you have the right to have access to data, to information that helps you determine whether your authorities are making the right decisions, and to monitor those decisions and the how effective those decisions are. And then the other one that came to mind is the right to participation. So we've talked about AI and AI ethics quite a bit in these discussions. And I, as a human being, I have the right to choose whether I want to participate in AI experiments, said experiments, but I suppose that is how it could be considered if you are not a data person. And then the last one, and I think this is one that we don't often think about and we absolutely have to, is the right to the access to data in our organizations. So everyone gets measured on, the decisions that they make, and we all have KPIs or KRAs or personal goals at work, and we get measured on those. And a lot of the decisions we make these days, if not all of them, are based on data. And if I, as an employee, do not have access to data that I need to make those decisions, then that affects my performance. So, as an employee, I have a right to information and data as well. So I think as data leaders, when we think about data and how we use it and how we make it accessible, if the standard should be that we have a human-based approach to data.
100%, 100%. And it was raised by a thought leader quite recently in one of our Clubhouse rooms, how much data, if you do kind of a job search in Indeed or any other kind of LinkedIn job sites, data is finding its way into so many job roles now. And I think that's really interesting because, as you mentioned there, Marissa, which is a lovely take on it, which is, we have the right to be successful in our work and to achieve and to hit our KPIs and goals. And if part of that is being noted in the job description as data, then naturally that access to data and access to succeeding is intrinsic to that. And I think it goes hand in hand with many discussions we've had before around the governance and data management side of, are we actually setting ourselves up internally in our organizations to fulfill those claims in those job roles of, being data driven and having those KPIs by that.
100%.
100%. Amazing. Kalani, over to you then. Your thoughts when we say data is a human right, what comes to mind for you?
Thank you, Catherine. So I also share the same sentiments with my ladies on the panel about data privacy. But I think for me, it also then extends to consent, right? Previously, we had access to all this information. And now, as and when we're doing processing, are we processing having the right consent? And also now, because the power has been given back to the human or the customer or the employee. But us as humans, now we've got much more rights where I can easily come and say, I want to know what information you have about me. And to organizations that have had data they've never destructed, what does that then now mean? Saying that I'm no longer your customer, why are you still keeping my information? Those deletion and destruction purposes, and also lawfully destructing that information accordingly, also just brings that element of it's still my human right saying I want my information to be destructed because I'm no longer your customer, I'm no longer your employee. Why are you keeping that data? Also taking into account the biases that we build in our models. As and when we build our models, what are those that we're taking into account, whether from gender, historical, and also taking into account behavioral biases that we might not know of, but in teams having collective or different aspects and different individuals, as and when we build our models, to also just take out some of the nuances that we might create in our models without even taking into account it might just be bias to the next individuals. So it's also the biases that I tend to pick up in some of the models that we currently have, and just being vocal about it on, are we aware as and when we put some of the models out there, the biases that we put in place.
100%. I did predict that bias and ethics would come up in this conversation for sure. But it's really interesting, that point about your data being destroyed and how long it's being kept for. I'm going to completely out myself. As many people know, if they've followed me on LinkedIn and see what we're doing in Business of Data, I recently got back from New York. got picked up by my partner from Heathrow Airport, was very jet lagged, may or may not have forgotten to pay the pickup charge. So got a lovely letter through the post saying, here's your fee, Miss King, please can you pay it? Obviously did, read through it, and it was really interesting to me because it does link to this conversation here, that they say in black and white, and it was actually in bold as well, which I thought was interesting. Your information that's been given, so my car registration, my address, my contact information, is going to be stored for 6 years. And I thought, goodness me, this interaction is so minute. It's kind of one transaction that I'm having with them, and they're going to store that data for 6 years. Why on earth do they need to do that? And I think that's just a really great example of this, where it's a case of the regulation and legislation may say one thing, but as brands and organizations, should we almost set our own standards within that as well? Because why are they keeping their data for that long? Obviously, I'm assuming it's for auditing processes and legal reasons like that. But it's still a bit jarring to think that that transaction was very small, yet the data period for keeping it is so long. So in that spirit, I'll ask each of you, do you think there is more that can be done by organizations that's almost going beyond what is current set in legislation? So we could talk about AI ethics here, given that there's not much regulation around it at the moment as a general broad brush stroke, or any other elements that we've spoken about today. Do you think organizations should be doing more and be better than the bar that is being currently set in this light? Wendy, I wonder if you'll take that one first.
Yes, sure. It's such a complex discussion in that there's so many nuances here that, to me, the regulations that come out of the different countries are really just a starting point. This is the minimum that a company should be doing when it comes to data privacy or deleting data for customers. And it does go back to your point of what should we be doing? But there's also, it's hard. It's really, really hard to delete data. And once a company has it, it's in so many different areas of their systems. When GDPR first came out, a lot of companies were taken off guard because you don't realize and how if your data is coming through and into a data warehouse, it's being backed up, that there's a lot of work that goes into deleting data. And it's processes that before some of the regulations, companies just didn't have as down pat as they do. And so the nuances of delete this data after 6 years, or this data after 2 years, or this data after 6 months, it's a hard thing to do. I think it's also really interesting of just, what do I want as a consumer? I want my data to be protected. I want it to be private, but I also want the company to personalize everything for me. And you can't have it both ways. That there's a point where you have to decide what's okay with me and what's not. And companies, I think, are still catching up with giving the different controls and nuances for those types of people.
100%. The phrase "have your cake and eat it" springs to mind in regards to that for certain. And I think it is such a complex thing, as you mentioned there. And I think very often in these sorts of content forums, we could quite easily, talk about these things as though it's really simple, turn on segmentation like that so that you can segment everyone's wishes and desires and it be totally personalized. We know that for the majority of organizations, it's not that simple. So how do we work towards it becoming that simple? What do we need from individual consumers? What do we need from a data capability, from a management capability, but also that business buy-in as well? They've got to really want this segmentation for it to be driven further than just what the data team can and want to do as well. So very, very interesting points there, Wendy. Kalani, how about yourself when it comes to brands and organizations doing more than what's maybe regulatorily expected of them?
So I'm starting to see a change in organizations now. And this also just coming from the high season of data breaches that are currently happening. Where now corporates are being reactive in trying to make sure that they've got the right data protection controls. They know who are the people that have access to their information. And also that education of just teaching the human beings or the individuals on how to better handle data. I'm picking that up. But when it comes to the ethics and like we're just talking about the deletion of data, I've also started to see the trends in organizations where now people are doing the risk-based approach, in saying what is our crown jewels of data that we want to make sure that we keep, and then we always protect it. But at the same time, what I've also picked up, it's those little data or that spreadsheet that we're keeping in somebody's laptop, that's the one that's easily hacked. So in terms of processing, I think business and corporates right now, they're starting to change the nuance and the maturity level of saying, how do we then process the data? How long we need to keep the data? And that we're also partnering like with our cybersecurity or our IT security partners together with the risk and the compliance. I've seen that partnership also coming in and saying, from a business value perspective, what are the controls that we then need to put in place? Also, when it comes to our policies and how we transact with our customers, are we ensuring that we're treating the customer fairly? So these are some of the things that we're starting to see in the organizations and even in some of the visions and the goals that corporates have, where now the customer is at the center, but they're also now looking at how do we process, how do we interact with this customer, making sure that from an ethics perspective, we're not violating anything, and trying by all means just to keep that specific customer at level at ease with how we're then going to be handling the data the moment we get to acquire it and process it.
I love that. So really just understanding that process and really just remembering that there's humans at the center of this. I think certainly during the boom of data, data everywhere, right? We know that we're collecting and consuming more than ever before and will continue to, but it is a reminder that these are individual people. At the end of financial data is a couple looking to buy their first mortgage on their home. At the end of banks, etc. You have a person setting up their first that has a very real set of emotions behind it. I think injecting that emotion back into the data can sometimes really aid these conversations, especially when we talk about ethics and bias, for sure. Thank you, Kalani. Maritza, how about you when it comes to organizations and brands just keeping themselves above the basic?
So many good points made by Kulani and Wendy. I agree with Kulani. I'm definitely starting to see more of a shift in terms of the thinking around data privacy, putting the customer in the center of data. But Wendy's point around, did we really have to wait for legislation until we started to implement data privacy is a very valid one. And I think that the shift that we are seeing is driven by legislation and compliance, not necessarily because organizations, are doing this because they're value-led or values-led. So I don't think that organizations are doing enough voluntarily. So specifically around AI ethics, I would be surprised if 5% of people on this panel or in the audience say to me that they have a model governance framework that they work according to, that their AI is explainable. I would be very surprised. And I don't think organizations going to put the effort into that until there's legislation that's going to drive the compliance. So no, I don't think organizations are doing enough voluntarily.
Really interesting. Of course, I'll save my favorite till last for sure, which is on the ethics point in AI. It's such a hot topic at the moment, and it impacts everyone. And I think that's the thing. It's not just even business value. It's in our personal lives. It's not just kind of sitting in that professional form of ourselves. It's in our personal lives as well. We've certainly seen some horror stories come out recently of what can go wrong when the ethics of our AI models aren't taken into full consideration. And we've spoken there about the biases in data sets and how drastically that can go wrong. And in fact, up and coming at the Business of Data Festival this week, we sit down with a thought leader who's co-authored a book surrounding AI ethics as well. So please do join to dive in deeper there. But I would like to dive in deeper with you three as well on this. Kalani, you mentioned ethics earlier and bias. What are you thinking about when it comes to data as a human right with AI ethics? I wonder if you could dive a bit deeper for me.
I think The AI part, right? The automated decision making. We build these models to replicate how a human being would think, right? But it's also, do we then also, with this automated decision making, do we then also go back and review, like what Marita highlighted, saying that do we have an AI or a model framework? Do we even have review committees for some of these models that we then put out there, or the AI solutions that we put out there? Because you might find it was all good and well at that specific time. The model worked then, but due to how the world or the globe is evolving, some of the things now we also need to go back and review. Even the automated decision making, we need to go back and review. So I think there's high time now, as organizations, that we also need to be responsible, as and when we are processing this information, that level of transparency, back to our customers on how we're then processing their information. When we do AI, are we also taking into account what are their views? Because at times we're making decisions on their behalf, and do we have the correct reflection, or the correct, in the collaborative teams, do we have true reflection of how the industry then looks like, or the community looks like? Because that's where some of this nuances will then be taken out of it, just to make sure that we're putting credible automated decision-making models, or AI models out there, with someone, that a human being that would have reviewed it.
Now, Kalani, I'm going to stay with you to ask you a follow-on question there. I'm well aware in the model ops community there's a bit of a debate as to who that reviewer should be, or what reviewer should sit in, whether it's data science, whether it's model operators, or someone else. Who do you think it should be to review those models?
So I would always say, have, for example, in the team, have the review, have the modelers, the data scientists, have your operational risk individual, have compliance, have legal, have cybersecurity, like I'm thinking at the top of my head, fraud, because in some of the models you need to know, are we literally opening ourselves to any fraudulent activities? So also just have that together with your data governance specialist, because they will tell you what are the guardrails and the data protection controls that we then need to take into account. But I think bringing in the risk fraternity, they also then best assist you in saying that from an operational risk, compliance, legal, what are those jurisdictions that we always need to work around, without having to violate anything from a business. And it also helps just getting a different aspect away from us being the data specialist, because then it's somebody else sitting outside that has a totally different view, but their reviews is always welcome on how we then make sure our models, or the work that we do, is well credible, and we've taken all the risk-based approach with their input.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. You mentioned there about kind of reviewing, going outside of the data team as well for that additional perspective, which is always wanted. Now, I knew you were giving lots of value there, Kalani, but my screen on my right here absolutely lit up with reactions. So it would seem the audience are gaining lots of value to you from you as well. So thank you. Wendy, when it comes to AI ethics and data as a human right, what's the flavor that you can add to this discussion?
I just want to, before I dive there, I wanted to comment on something Kalani had said, that all the different areas and groups that should be weighing into these models. And I think inherent in those as well is that lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and whether that's specific people that have that focus looking at the models, or whether it's training across the teams in that we want to make sure that we're thinking about that equity and inclusion, and that the models are not being unintentionally biased. And I think that was mainly where I was thinking. From an ML perspective too, it's so much about the data that we're comfortable being. It goes back to the access to the data and what data is being used to drive those models, and me being comfortable that these are the ways that you're calculating and determining the models. And that's a hard thing, where we want that visibility. I think it also goes back to Kalani's point earlier of, I should be able to ask for what information you have on me, so that I can better understand how that's being used for the models.
100%, and it's interesting because I think we in the lay data space, you assume that that's going to be a nice PDF that's going to be like, here's your data, here's how it's being used, there you go, consumer. But we know, as we've mentioned throughout the discussion, it's not as simple as that for sure. Maritza, AI ethics. We've only got a few minutes. I've had to look down at the clock, and you just saw me go, oh goodness me, we've only got a few minutes left. AI ethics and data as a human right. What's your thoughts?
So the one thing that's been a challenge, and specifically around data privacy legislation implementation. So in South Africa, POPI's been around for a long time, and most organizations started to look at the principles and implementing the principles probably about 10 years ago. So I've been involved with a few of those implementations, and my question to the legal department is always, okay, we understand exactly what POPI or GDPR means in terms of my privacy, my data privacy, when it comes to very transactional things like marketing and consent. But what does it mean around my future? Because my future is also private. And how do we apply that thinking in analytics? And that's a much harder question to answer. In fact, I've never received an answer when I've asked that question. And it's probably because it is a really difficult question to answer. So as data leaders, again, I think, the only approach is to remember that there's an actual human in your data, and to treat that human with dignity, and to remember that that human has rights, and to approach everything that you do in data analytics from that human-based approach. There's no other way.
Wow. I mean, what a mic drop moment to end on. These discussions always go by so quickly, and I really ought to have a glaring timer up in front of me. But we have run out of time today. Thank you, each of you, for joining me and giving some of your thoughts. I know we could obviously go on for much longer on such a deep topic. And thank you for those getting involved in the comment section there. It's really interesting to read your comments as we go through. But thank you to each of you for joining us today. Now, this week we have an incredibly busy week here at the Business of Data. We do have our Global Business of Data Festival broadcasting in all regions as of Tuesday and Wednesday. So wherever you are joining us from, there will be a broadcast in your time zone. We will be discussing so many different topics, from data mesh through to data culture. You can register via the BOD. So you'll be able to find a link in the comments. I'll pop it in there in a moment's time. And next week we have the deadline for our Business of Data Awards based in North America. So if you know someone who is an absolute superstar in data analytics and you think they deserve some recognition, then please do pop in a nomination. But that is everything for now. I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks so much.
Wanting to meet with other senior executives in the data and analytics space? In an environment that is created for connection and inspiration? Then why not join one of our in-person conferences? We have events all over the world, and you can find out the ones closest to you by visiting coriniumintelligence.com/events.